Thank you so much for having me. And I apologize that I can't physically be there, which was my intent. It just with my teaching schedule, it just became kind of a nightmare given some of the stuff that's going on here, which I'm happy to explain at another time if you're interested. So I'm going to share my screen because I have some slides I want to show. And let me just pull that up right now. Oops, not screen, not screen. I want to share my slides. Okay. For this purpose, I want to talk a little bit about like a few different games I've worked on, including the ones you looked at, and talk a little bit about this sort of general idea. But this question of like designing metrics for games, which is really as much a question of game design as it is a question of actual metrics, right? Because one of the things that's really important about this process, and just to give a little bit of my background, I have done what we call like serious game development or impact game development for something like 20 years in a variety of fields, right? Journalism, healthcare, education, politics, like physical activity, college preparation, right? Like a whole range of different fields with a number of different organizations from like USAID to Red Cross Red Crescent to NIH, which is National Institute of Health in the United States, or NIMH, National Institute of Mental Health, or NSF, which is National Science Foundation. So like a wide variety, ProPublica, which is one thing I'm going to show very soon. It's like a wide variety of institutions. But what you find here is that when you're working on games for impact, and I don't think I'm saying anything anybody doesn't know, you're like proving the impact is as much a part of the experience as anything else, right? And one of the things that's really critical for game designers to keep in mind in the process of designing games for impact is that the game is only successful if the impact is successful. And the impact can only be determined as successful if the measurement of the impact is accurate. So then the designing of that measurement is a critical part of the game design process. And in fact, it's actually a very, very foundational part of the game design process is what I want to argue in this presentation. So in that sense, I want to just start looking at different, like a couple of projects I've worked on and just talk about some of the lessons I've learned from them. So can I advance this way? Great. Yeah. So I just want to start by talking very quickly about this project I worked on with ProPublica called The Waiting Game. This was an initiative that my company Playmatics did with ProPublica. It was an idea we brought to them. It was a response to some of the dialogue in the United States around asylum seeking. And that was problematic to me. And I had a friend at ProPublica named Cece Way, she's no longer at ProPublica, but she's an interactive journalist. Like she does journalism around interactive formats. And we talked about this idea of like creating something that would give people an experience of what asylum seeking was like to make an more informed conversation around asylum. And this ProPublica was interested in this because as an investigative journalism entity, they wanted to like their job is to sort of showcase how systems work and don't work. And so they wanted to like look at the asylum system as a dysfunctional system and talk about this dysfunction. So um, the very basic idea of the game is that you choose a character that's based on an actual asylum seeker to the United States that we got in conversation with a human rights watch organization out of Mount Sinai that does psychology around asylum seekers. So we anonymized a number of stories, and then we built this game-ish application where you could play through their stories, and you did that by playing through every day of their life from the moment they decided to seek asylum in the United States to the moment their asylum case was decided. And so you're only given one option in the game, which is to either keep going or give up. If you keep going, you get another day. If you give up, you stop. And the days are procedurally generated. They're not written in advance, but they're based on the occurrences that happened in that person's life during the time that they were in that space. So they're slightly randomized, but they're mostly just flavor. The key thing is it just takes many, many days. And since an asylum case in the United States can take like 3 to 7 years, and you're clicking through every day, you're talking about clicking 1,000 to 2,000 times to get through the whole story. No one does that. So instead, people quit. And when we quit, we capture them on a screen that tells them how many days they lasted and then gives them the context of the actual story, right? So in this case, this person made it 48 days by clicking 48 times. when the actual experience of the person they're talking to was over 2,000 days. And that was meant to like give them a sense of just how long the asylum process took. That was the idea. This was coupled with journalism around the topic that ProPublica and WNYC, which is public radio in New York, covered about how asylum works, how it doesn't work, what happens to asylum seekers when they exit the system, et cetera. So it was a larger journalistic project on a page. Now, I'm talking about this because this game released, this was like shortly before the pandemic, right? Like, I think around 2018. And when it did, ProPublica started pushing it through its journalistic network. And that was interesting, right? Because it led to this question of whether the project was successful, right? Was this a successful project? Well, on the one hand, it actually did very, very well according to a lot of metrics, right? Like if we looked at our press coverage, it actually did quite well. It was described as a game of existential dread in a praised way. That there's not many games that are about existential dread. I was very proud of that one. That's why I put it in here. But like immigration groups talked about it a lot. It was nominated for and won a couple of interactive journalism and infographic awards. It circulated pretty far. And in terms of engagement on the site, like just how long people spent on ProPublica, it was like more than triple the amount of time they would spend with a normal article, right? So on all of those fronts, it looked really good. But what was interesting is that ProPublica was kind of disappointed with it. And the reason why was because ProPublica's goal as an interactive journalistic site is to change the minds of people who don't already agree with it. Like that's like their mission. So from the measurements they didn't really see new audiences coming to this page. It was all like pre-existing ProPublica audiences. So from their thinking about the system, right, what their journalism does, it wasn't that successful. Now, what's interesting is that ProPublica didn't really blame the game for that. They felt like they didn't really know what to do with the game and they didn't quite market it properly. But I think this problem speaks to the sort of intersection of all of these issues in a really interesting way. By all accounts, Playmatics and ProPublica made a really good, really powerful and original and very efficacious object as a game. But it wasn't targeted exactly right, and we weren't thinking about how it would be delivered exactly right. And so when we looked at the data we produced, it didn't actually do what we wanted it to do, right? It kind of failed at one of its missions. And I think that speaks to like the spectrum of these kind of problems. I think that the issue on this project essentially was that there was a data point that didn't circulate through all of the partners right. That was something we really needed to check, which is like, is this piece going to target people who are not already subscribers or followers of ProPublica, or are they going to come from particular demographics that this is targeted at? And that was something I didn't know when I was working on the project, that was a critical need. That was something that wasn't really circulated between the people making the product on ProPublica's side and the marketing team. And thus, when the product came out, it was measured against that measure, which it was never really built to do. And had we known that, we would have built it differently. So that, I think, gives you kind of a picture of like what's at stake in these issues, right? Like, how do you think about these kind of problems? So using that as a kind of starting place, I want to look at some other stuff that I've worked on and talk a little bit about how we think about this process, because there is a process by which you do this that I've used for many years. And I think it's a strong process that like highlights some of the really critical details of how you kind of design metrics in line with game design so that you know the game is performing what you want it to, and then the game can get you the data you need. So how do you go through this process? I want to look at an example of another game I worked on that's in the educational space. I like using games in the educational space because the metrics here are often very clear, right? You know, billions of dollars have been spent building these kind of measurements, at least in the US in education. So like anything you study in education in the United States has like, you know, an industry of measurement behind it. So I like using educational games as a starting place just because it's like an easy way to talk about like the kind of measurements we're looking at. Playmatics, I guess this was about 6 or 7 years ago, did a game with a group called the Society of Cincinnati, which is a group around like sort of that studies American history and preserves certain aspects of the early days of American history around the time of the Revolution. We made a game called Revolutionary Choices. And this was a project that the Society of Cincinnati came to us to make. in relation with a producer that they knew. And the goal of the game, from their mind, was that education about the American Revolution was often incorrect in the United States, and they wanted to create an experience that kids would be engaged with that would teach more accurate history of that point in time, right? About like what was happening during the revolution, and in particular, what was the Americans' relationship with Europe? What were the goals of the early American endeavor in terms of the revolution? Like, what were they actually trying to accomplish, and what would victory look like? And most importantly, because this is almost unknown in a lot of circles in the United States, that there were different groups that made up the United States in terms of its federalization, right? There was a Congress, there were states which were very powerful, and there was an army. And those three things were always in negotiation with each other. And that understanding the American Revolution is actually understanding the power struggle between those groups. And so this was all like new stuff. So how do we build this game? And of course, it's important to the Society of Cincinnati that it actually teaches, right? Like they don't want to make a game and throw it out and have it not perform its task. So we need to figure out like how do we understand that the game we're making does that goal, right? That we've performed the goal we're trying to perform, which is a shorthand of saying, what kind of measurement do we have to do on the game? The very first thing we have to do that is be extremely explicit about what the design goals of the project are, right? Like, so it's not enough to say the sentence I just said, right? Like this little paragraph I just said about what the goals were. We had to be really explicit about exactly what the game was going to teach. That is not something that Playmatics did, right? We didn't actually do that at all. That was handled by the Society of Cincinnati, right? So the Society of Cincinnati had historians, they had researchers, they had education experts, right? And all three of those things, right? People who were subject matter experts on the topic of the American Revolution, who we could rely on when we needed facts about the American Revolution, and people who studied pedagogy, who understood what kinds of experiences could be testable experiences. That needed to happen first. Now, we're not building any measurements yet, right, at this stage. We're just articulating exactly what the impact goals are. And this is, I think, very, very critical. I'm going to talk about this again a little bit later in the talk. But the reason why this is so critical is we're obviously in a topic like this, we're in an extremely dense historical period where there's lots of things we could teach and there's lots of things we could expose players to. And of course, in an educational setting, you're always thinking about things like reading level and are there basic math skills that they could learn and to what extent are they engaged in generalized critical thinking, right? And like all of that stuff is awash in this project. And that's kind of always true, right? Like these topics and these goals are always much bigger than the individual implementation is going to be. And if you don't define very clearly what you're going to target the experience at, you can get totally lost in that sea. And that leads to all sorts of problems in development. On the metric side, it leads to a problem where you're gathering data you don't need. And you don't want to do that. That's wasting development resources and it's cluttering up the information you're getting in terms of anybody's ability to process it. So I think you're basically like thinking a lot about exactly how to refine these goals. And it should be the very first thing that happens on the project. And I enforce this, by the way, on every single impact project I work on of any sort. It doesn't matter if it's healthcare or a brand that if I'm working on a television brand and I'm trying to advertise the brand and create a media extension for it, or I'm working with a government organization on an international outreach. The very first step is just understanding if this project was successful, what would it do, right? Once that is kind of established, you then want to map those goals to measure, and you do this without really thinking about the gameplay, right? Like it's actually kind of important that this happen before the gameplay gets too far down the road. In Revolutionary Choices, our goals were educational, right? And so we had this list of design goals, which I mentioned to you about the roles of different aid entities, the objectives of the American Army, and then some critical figures that were involved. And then we take those ideas and then we built them into educationally valid rubrics of history education, right? So we lift out of history education, in our case, okay, well, what are the rubrics of history education in the American school system? How do they relate to these topics? How do we make sure that in the testing methodologies that are used in those history examples, we can pull out what would demonstrate expertise on these topics independently of their game existence, right? And what I want to point out here is remember that we're very early in this process. We don't even really know what this game is yet. We haven't designed the game yet. We're just trying to understand like what would constitute success on our impact goals. So we just design that independently of game design, right? We use like testing methodology to tell us what that is. Now, that's not going to give us a game, right? We don't get a game automatically out of that. But that foundation becomes the thing that an impact game designer can use, right? Like once I have that information, then I can build a game around that. And just to point it out, like that's the reason why we were using things like standard rubrics in history education is because we were coming from that field. Other fields will use different things. So for example, if I work on a game, I've worked on a lot of games around ADHD and executive function. And in those cases, I'm working with neuroscientists, and the neuroscientists have diagnostic tests that determine certain levels of attention, certain levels of ignoring distracting elements, certain levels of multitasking. And those become the kind of standards by which we use measurement. And so those are just basically demonstrated to me. It's like, and they're demonstrated to me in like quite strict ways, like, okay, we need a reaction time that's under this many milliseconds, right? Or when we do a test that involves saliency of two objects, meaning the difference you can see between like this white dot and this black background and this gray dot and this black background, we see a difference in time that's about X, right? And so those become measurements that we can use. And again, these dots are not a game, right? There's nothing gameplay about this. But now I have a sense of like what our target is. And that can be done with psychological measures. That's what we're doing with Way Out right now is we're working with social emotional measures around empathy and compassion and towards trust. Or it could be other kinds of demonstration of knowledge. Like it could literally just be a skill, right? Like maybe I'm breathing into it. This is a famous serious game about asthma where people had to breathe into a machine to build up their lung capacity. And I know you did it right if you can breathe into the machine, right? Like it's literally a physical thing you do. So I can actually test you against that thing. I don't know if we have a capacity. I guess I should just hold questions to the end. Like I have an instinct to kind of pause and see how everybody's doing, but should I just wait till the end for questions, or does anybody have anything they want to say at this point? Okay. Yeah. Sorry, just in the presentation system, I can't see anybody right now, so I'm just sort of like, wow. I hope I hope this isn't going out into space. Thank you for that. All right, I'll just keep going then. All right. So at this point in a process, you know the impact goals at some level that you've decided on, and hopefully you've locked them as a team, right? Like you've made decisions and discussed them, and you've locked them down so that they're set. And then you simply go into a measurement step where you start asking like what's possible to measure in these things, and are there standards that we have? I think it is absolutely critical to any impact project, just to say this as strongly as I can, to have three people or three groups, like three entities on the project. There needs to be someone who understands games and is developing games, and that's like the technical and design expertise to make a game. There needs to be a subject matter expert who understands the content that you're talking about and can be the resource for the content, in terms of like what the topic of the game is. And then there needs to be someone who understands the methodology by which that content can be evaluated, right? The subject matter expert and the metrics expert could be part of the same entity because they often are. I mean, obviously, nonprofits and impact focused organizations often do this kind of measurement and do it internally and have those people, but those roles all have to be present, right? Because a game developer cannot do it. And if you ask a game developer to do it, they will not do it right. They often don't understand the strictness of testing methodology in different fields. And I gave a journalistic example at the top because that is enormously strict. And they'll get it wrong. They'll make bad measurements. And subject matter experts don't necessarily understand that evaluative structure either because they might be very deep in the subject in a way that doesn't actually speak to education or persuasion. So you want to have somebody who just thinks about that problem. Once you have that, then you design the gameplay around the measures, right? Because the measures become the target. Like the impact goal is the target, but the impact goal is understood to be quantified through the measures. So like I want the measures, like I want to know what I'm teaching. So in revolutionary choices, what you're seeing on this screenshot is an event that happens in revolutionary choices. And because we knew that we wanted to introduce these major figures and familiarity with figures was going to be tested essentially by remembering them and doing actions with them, and because we want to emphasize the idea that users would look at different roles of different entities in the American government to make decisions, the core gameplay was then built around that. So the buttons you see at the bottom are related to different organizations, and they are actually mapped to those organizations permanently. The reason why the middle one is blank is because essentially there's no Congress role in this action, because one of these buttons is related to the army doing something, and one of these buttons is related to the states doing something. And so you're choosing, do you want the states to handle this or the army to handle this? And every choice you're presented with in revolutionary choices asks you to do that. Do you assign it to the army, to the Congress, or the states? And so by doing that, we're reinforcing the idea that every single decision you make is tied somehow to which entity is doing it. So in an educational setting, when this is done with a post-testing experience, we know that players have been learning the entire time of the game what things Congress is good at, what things the army is good at, and what things the states are good at, so that we know that they can answer questions about that at the end of the experience, right? And so because we knew what the post-test was going to look like, and essentially like what the measurements were on the post-test, we could design the game in connection with all those educational goals so that the mechanics spoke directly to the test. Now, in revolutionary choices, this is a little bit separated, right? Like you do the game and then there's a post test that comes after the game. It doesn't have to be that way. There are times in which the choices in the game are identical to taking a test, right? And an example I use for this all the time is something like Pokemon for testing basic math skills, right? If you play Pokemon, like the card game or the digital game, you are constantly picking actions that have numeric values, applying those numeric values to a simple algebraic equation, and then getting a result. And smart decisions in Pokemon are essentially smart decisions in adding and subtracting, right? That's like basically what the game is about. I don't have to really test you about adding, subtracting if you play Pokemon well. You literally were adding and subtracting the whole time. So the game itself can be a measurement tool if the skill in the game maps directly to the measurement. So I could actually take the measurement and just drop it into my game. And when you make games about math, this is what you often do. You just have them do math, right? And if they successfully do math, ta-da, they've solved the problem. All you have to do essentially is decontextualize it from the gameplay so that you can show that it's a meta skill that's not just tied to this like one specific visual representation. But I mean, if the evaluation of the metric is a demonstration of something that could be done in gameplay, then the game can just do everything. You need context to do it outside of that. That's what you're seeing in Way Out, which I'm going to talk about again in a few moments. So that process, right? Establish the impact goals, figure out what the measurements of the impact goals are, and what successful adoption of whatever the impact goals would be in measurement is, and then provide that to game design as the foundation for how game design works. That's the metric process, right? That's like the design of metric process. So thinking about that, there's a couple of critical considerations that I want to bring up that I think are like the really kind of essential things that a developer is going to say to you if they're smart about impact goals and like they want to talk to you about like how you're designing your the metrics for an experience to prove something. I want to say this again because this is the central problem. The design goals have to be limited. There have to be a small number of impact goals. The instinct that people almost universally have when they start working on an impact game is they start realizing the potential of games as a form, and they start getting very excited about what the game can do. And then the impact goals start to stretch because they start to see that, oh, if we're going to teach A and B, we could probably just teach C because we need that content anyway. And then we could probably teach D, and then we could probably teach E. And then the goals are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And that's becoming very difficult to design a game around, right? Partly because it's basically meaning that like the things you have to measure are starting to get so large that you have to start building very, very specific things to measure all of them, and the game is getting diffuse because like now it has to do 5 things rather than 2. But then secondly, it creates a problem in the hierarchy of game design because designing for an impact goal really means prioritizing that goal. And the more goals that pop up, the harder it is to keep them all at equal priority, right? So isolating down to like exactly what is the most important thing in the game is extremely helpful to design because there's a counter pressure all the time in game design about making the game fun, right? Like you want the game to be enjoyable. That's why you're making a game, right? That's the value of game design. And making the game fun almost inevitably pulls the game away from its impact goal. So there's this pressure in impact game design to make something fun in such ways that it goes away from the impact goals and then to pull it back towards the impact goals, which makes it less fun. And the navigation of an impact game design is going back and forth between those two things, right? It's like, I'm trying to make the game more fun. Now I need to make it more accurate. Now I need to make it more fun. Now I need to make it more accurate. And there's like a flow that happens there. That's a solvable problem, right? You can make fun impact games, but the more goals you have, the harder it is to do because those goals don't always move in the same direction. Some of them pull away from each other. And I can actually give examples of cases where they're mutually exclusive, that like teaching 2 things that seem very close to each other actually drive them away from each other completely. And you just have to make a decision about which one you want to do if you want to have a functional game. So the key here is just to kind of keep scope low, right? Like figure out what the important targets are and list them. There's nothing wrong with dropping C, D, and E as nice to haves in a list. The game designer might decide that like C is really easy to get and can put it in, but knowing that A and B are the critical ones is what's going to make the game possible to build. Second point. There's also an instinct sometimes, and I feel stupid saying this in certain circles because people who understand data will always just laugh about this on their own. So I'm just saying the thing that everybody knows in data, but it's good to kind of put it on the table in case somebody hasn't heard it before, is that sometimes you get to a point where you're like looking at building metrics for a game, and people recognize that in a digital game, it's actually pretty easy to create a tracking of metrics because the game, any action that happens in a game happens digitally. It's tied to state. So if an action happens, then the system knows it happened. So it's not really that hard to then record the action, right? Like if you click a button in a game, I know you click the button. I know when you click the button. I know the context under which you click the button. So all you're really asking me to do with metrics is record that in a smart way, right? Record it so I can read it. That's really the technical ask. It's not trivial to do, but it's actually not that hard to do if the whole team knows they have to do it from the beginning. So when people learn that on impact game projects, they often will say something like, well, just track everything, right? Like that becomes the instinct that people have when they talk about game development. It's like, well, just track everything that's going on. And that is nonsensical, right? Like you can't track everything. Like that doesn't make any sense. I'm always looking at a subset of the things that the player does. I mean, there's literally things the computer can't read. But then there's also this question of like if I add this stuff to a database, I'm just making a database bigger, right? I'm just making there be more stuff you have to comb through. And some of it is going to be redundant. Some of it is going to be unnecessary. Some of it's not clear and it's not going to help you do anything, right? Some of it might be useful to you in very specific equations, but like actually capturing it in a way that can be useful could be hard, right? So data design is a design step, right? It's not something you just throw the developer and say, hey, you're already tracking things, just give us all of that, right? Like that's not going to perform what you want. It's very critical that there's a focus in exactly which parts of the game's data are going to be necessary for the measures, and that's what needs to be captured. That can be a conversation with technical development, right? Like the programmers on a project will happily talk to the people designing the measures to say like, well, what can we track and how can we track it and what will work? And depending on the case you're working in, sometimes there are things that are just very difficult to track. So for example, when we worked on games about reaction time, there are just processor limits on how accurate things happen within a game. And especially if you work, I'm just going to give you a really specific example of this. Um, Memory on a computer is actually really good at multi-threading. It's like computers are designed to do multiple things at once. Memory on a phone is not memory on a computer, and it doesn't do that because your phone is always waiting for a phone call or waiting to find network. So memory on a phone functions differently than memory on a computer. So asking a phone to track reaction time the way you do on a computer doesn't really work, right? Because the phone, you can't rely on the phone to be paying attention to the app all the time, right? And that's just like a technical reality. And so knowing that is really important. But if that data is really important, then you can find ways to work around it or to approximate it in a way that's going to be useful to data. But what's not going to work is just asking for the developers to just track everything. It's a design step. It needs to be a design step, and it needs to be as focused as it can be because everything else that you track is just noise that's wasting the developers and the researchers' time. Um, and then I think there's a really critical step in this process, which is an iterative loop that happens between the people involved in measurement and the gameplay people. As I mentioned, there's this pressure to like make the game fun, then make the game accurate, then make the game fun, then make the game accurate, and going back and forth between those two things. The way that you get around that problem through design is essentially by using the iterative process to make it work. When I develop impact games, I tell the subject matter experts that the first build I make is going to be broken in terms of the impact goals. Just because I know that's going to happen. Like, we're going to get some stuff wrong. There's content we don't know from the subject matter experts because we're not subject matter experts. We don't necessarily understand exactly what fidelity or a purity of data means in the measurement process. So we'll make some assumptions that will be wrong. And so we build drafts that we then show to the measurement experts that they evaluate, right? So they're evaluating it very strictly just based on their evaluation criteria. Like, the gameplay doesn't really matter. They're not even paying attention to whether it's fun. They're just looking at the gameplay and saying, does this measure what we say it's going to measure? Where is it going wrong? And then that should lead to a kind of iterative loop where the developers create games for the evaluators, and then the evaluators kick the tires of the game to make sure that it's sticking to the evaluative goals that they set up. And then they give notes that go back to the developer, and you go back and forth on that. It's very critical that this happen in the early prototyping stage of any game that's focused on a single mechanic, because that mechanic is going to deliver a lot of the impact goals of the project. So the earliest part of the design needs to be this loop, right? Of like, developer makes something, hands it to the metrics people hand it to the game designers with notes, the game designers revise back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Because what you're hoping for is to end in some kind of proof of concept, like some kind of minimum viable product of the gameplay where everybody on the team is like, yes, this gameplay works towards this impact goal with data that can demonstrate the impact goal was successful. And that a lot of the development time should be spent on that part of the process, because if that goes wrong, then the project isn't working. So I want to talk about this in relation to Way Out, because you looked at Way Out, just to kind of like give you a sense of how this is working in Way Out. And kind of like just in the last like 8 minutes, I've got just like paint a very quick picture of how this is in operation in a project we're working on right now. So Way Out is a collaboration between Playmatics and a filmmaker named Diana Steinfeld, who has worked in issues of sexual violence and harassment and sort of like healing processes as a result of incidents of sexual trauma. The goal behind the game is Daniela's goal on this game is very, very straightforward, and like, she has a very clear sense of what she wants this game to do. It's to talk to people who are not paying attention to issues of sexual trauma and maybe unwittingly, unconsciously reinforcing certain aspects of misogyny, and present them with opportunities to learn how to be allies to people going through that trauma, which is both designed for, it has two real kind of social purposes. The first is to create more information about allyship in the world, because often Bad allyship is re-traumatizing to people who have endured sexual violence. And that empathy should reduce the presence of the general misogyny, because if people were more empathetic to victims of sexual trauma, they would be less likely to condone the structures that create those kind of conditions. So what that means is that the game is being targeted at a population that is not that interested in this topic, right? Like it's a population that just doesn't normally think about these things and probably wouldn't play a game that was explicitly about them. So that informs the game design, right? We know that no one who picked up this game is thinking they're going to play a game where they're going to meet somebody who suffered sexual harassment and we're going to talk to them about sexual harassment. If they knew that, they probably wouldn't play it. So we need gameplay that's going to make that interesting to them. So it's a game, right? I'm not even going to bother explaining this slide, but like, there's nothing about sexual harassment on this slide. This is about putting out fires, right? And solving a level by putting out fires. You're looking at a very, very early prototype. This is like 3 weeks into development level prototype. But this is designed basically just to like create a gameplay mechanic that's interesting to that audience. And the reason why we're doing that is because one metric that's really important to us is like people playing the game for long periods of time, right? It's like we've got to allow people to develop the skills over time in the game. So one important metric for us is just like play duration. So we need a game that's going to keep people playing for a while. Where the actual learning happens is that alongside this sort of team-based gameplay, and if you're familiar with games, I want you to imagine games like Dragon Age or Fire Emblem, like games where you have a party and the party works together, but they all have like trust issues or needs or personal missions. Think about Mass Effect 2, right? Not Mass Effect 2, but Mass Effect also. I guess Mass Effect 2 as well, but anyway, Mass Effect is another game like this. Where you basically, part of your gameplay is making sure that these people like you and that you've done things to help these people so that they'll work with you. So we have a similar thing in this game where members of your team come to you between missions to talk to you about what's going on for them. And one of them is Anna. And what you don't realize at the beginning of the game is that Anna is a victim of sexual harassment from the organization that you're all part of. So your boss has sexually harassed Anna. And in a repeated and quite disturbing way. And so Anna doesn't trust you at the start of the game. So Anna doesn't talk about that at the start of the game. But if you say the right things to Anna as the game continues, Anna will start to trust you and then will open up more. And so the idea here is that by having proper conversations with Anna towards being empathetic and compassionate and being a good ally, you build the relationship with Anna in such a way that Anna will open up more to you about what's going on and you can continue to be an ally to her, right? And that's the goal of the game. And if you do that poorly, Anna doesn't trust you and then Anna starts performing worse in the gameplay, right? Because Anna just doesn't agree with what you're doing or believe you. So as we're doing this in Way Out, actually the conversations serve two purposes, right? Some of the conversations are training, right? Like the idea is that we're not expecting users to know anything about empathy or about allyship. And actually the reason why we're making this game is because often allyship is very, very wrong when people are even trying to be helpful. So we want some of these conversations to just be opportunities to experiment with that, right? Like, so we basically build conversations where you can kind of screw up, right? And you just play around with it and see where you're going. Other conversations are meant to be evaluative, right? They're like actually tests of your ability. So after you've gone through some conversations where you've had a chance to train, we give you an opportunity to be tested. Playmatics is doing exactly the same thing in the Cadence game that was mentioned in the introduction. That game is about relationship health. And in some conversations, you're sort of learning how you talk to people to learn about potentially abusive relationships. And then in what we call boss fights, you are tested to see if you've learned what you needed to know. And those are used as evaluation steps. And those are treated differently in the data, right? We don't really track like what you're doing in training very much. We just like look at like your generalized behavior in terms of like, well, how many times did you do this? And what are common wrong answers you're picking? And that's more to just sort of like learn about how the game could better teach, right? Like that's not actually us using it to evaluate the impact goals because we're not checking the impact goals there. Those metrics are more about what do we see people doing and how could the game be better at what it does, right? In the testing scenes, though, they're tests, right? We treat them as tests. And so we actually build the metrics around them as tests. But those conversations then need a different form, right? They have to be a little bit separate from the rest of the game design, right? Because they have to be decontextualized from some of the rest of the game design. They have to be higher stakes. They have less scaffolding in them, so there's less things helping you. And like we're actually like going to publish those things out to a different source so that when researchers are looking at it, this is the data they're looking at to see if the game is successful, right? So when we think about these different objects in the games, the conversations, which look basically identical to a user, are actually two completely different structures. They're designed differently. They're scaffolded differently. The content in them is different. The data that's tracked in them is different. And they're delivered technically to different places so that they can be used for research for different reasons. And all of that happens because we know that that's coming. Now, to do this, we need a measure, and our measure is coming from Yale and UNESCO because they've been working on measurements of things like compassion and social emotional competency. And so what's literally happening right now, like this is literally what we're doing. Like I had a call before this presentation that was literally about this. A researcher at UNESCO is looking at these empathy measurements and now starting to build like specific measures the games could use so that we could know from dialogue based decisions, okay, what would show empathy in different subdivisions of empathy? Like what would answers look like that could demonstrate empathy? And once he's done that report, we're going to use that to write scripts that we're going to send back to him to evaluate, right? So he's going to come up with the measure. He's going to do that over the next week. And then we're going to use that measure to revise the twine that you saw, right? So we built that twine just as a way of giving him an example of what dialogue could look like. Where like, and we told him like, this is a raw prototype. All of this is going to change. We just want to get you a sense of like what characters sound like and what a choice in a dialogue will look like. He's using that to build a measure, and then he's going to send that back to us with notes, and we're going to use that to rewrite that script in the twine so that it matches the measure. And our expectation is that will be sent to him. He will evaluate it against the measure and tell us where we got it wrong. We'll go back and rewrite it, and that loop will continue until that section is approved. That section is a proof of concept of like, playing this dialogue does generate the data that we need to demonstrate empathy. And then once that's done, that becomes the template by which we build the rest of the conversations in the version of the game that we're building right now. All right. So that's my presentation.